Tell you what, it's not often in Kentucky until you can say, well, at least we got a football game Saturday, right? Last night was a rough night for the Kentucky ball team. Well, I would say we'd get a draft pick, but it went to the Raiders. Yeah, the Cowboys are not good. You know, it's a sad thing. I remember Nathan when he was maybe in fourth grade down there in Mississippi. Everybody likes the Saints. Better. Sunday morning, he got up and he had blood running down the side of his face. And so he had a perforated eardrum. So he says it's from listening to me too much, but it's not. So with the stuff they put him on, I think it was due to a ear infection and some sort of cold and such. But he is on a lot of antibiotics. And he seems to be better. He's here tonight. And so I look back there like he's actually here. That's where he was. Hopefully he's in class. Okay, you talk about providence. We planned this out, what we're studying this year, back in January. But tonight we are in Ecclesiastes 8. And this lesson may be tailor-made for the Wednesday night after an election. And so as I was going through, looking it over again today, making sure I had my notes and trying to find any misspelled words, I thought, wow, this is kind of relevant. But anyway, as you go through it. So last night was one of those elections where I think everybody's a little happy and a little upset. It was one of those little bit for everybody sort of elections, which may be what's best for our country every once in a while to have those kind. But what we're going to go through as we look at this is where Solomon talks about kings. Now, what's funny is Solomon is a king. But he talks about kings, and he talks about the power they have, and the fact that sometimes kings are not as smart or as wise as they think they are. And how sometimes it's rough when you live in a government, we live in a country that has a government that's not as good as you want it to be. When you try to figure out how to exist and how to live among people you don't always agree with. So, like I said, it turns out to be fairly relevant as we go through it. Let's read the first 4 verses of chapter 8. If you look down that right column, that's the New King James Version. If you got your own Bible with a different version, it may even help more to see a little bit different. Solomon says, "Who is like a wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. Where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say to him, what are you doing?" All right, so we go through that right there. Well, let's go down to verse 6. "He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful, and a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. Because for every matter there is a time and a judgment, though the misery of man increases greatly." All right. When you're studying the Bible, especially wisdom literature, the aspect of wisdom is different than knowledge. Knowledge is knowing fact. Wisdom is more of knowing how to use the facts that you have. You can have a PhD in something and still have trouble in life because you don't know how to use the things that you know. And so wisdom is that aspect or that idea of being able to use the facts that you have. And especially from the Bible, it's the idea, especially in Ecclesiastes, it's the idea of being able to step out of our life and see things the way God would see them. Instead of being selfish for our own purposes, sometimes it's good to step back and say, what is it that God is doing here? What is God's purpose in this place and in this time that he's working? And so notice here in verse 1, wisdom is a very rare thing. If you're reading the notes, wisdom is a very rare thing, especially in what? Government, right? We talked in our Sunday morning Bible class as we were talking about politics a little bit, and we talked about Ronald Reagan said the two scariest statements a person ever uttered were what? Number one is, I am from the government, and number two is what? I am here to help you, right? According to Ronald Reagan, those are the two scariest things you could ever hear, and sometimes that can be true. And so he brings out here, as he looks here, the problem why it's scary, when we see in the next few verses, is first of all, is there any person who's perfect? No. Everybody is a sinner, even the king. Even the king falls short. Remember, we studied last week, going through chapter 7. God made all people perfect, and yet all men scheme. God made us to be perfect, and yet we all have our own ways. We all have selfishness within us, and it gets us in trouble. Well, where that runs into trouble is back at this time, kings had absolute authority. If the king said, stop following God, we're going to follow an idol, guess what? The people were pushed in the way in which the king went. And so it's a scary thing when you're in a monarchy and the king is evil. It's a very scary thing to have. And so what he says here in verse 2, keep the king's commandment. Why? Because it's your oath. What does the Bible teach us about following government? We're to obey, right? Romans 13, right? 1 through 5 or 1 through 3, right? Over in 1 Peter, it said, fear God, honor the king. Okay? First, you're doing it for the Lord's sake. Absolutely. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 1, pray for who? All men should pray, especially for those who are in authority and in power. All right, here's the issue. Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, 1 Timothy chapter 2. The king at that day was, if not Nero, very close to the time of Nero. One of the worst men who have ever reigned, one of the worst leaders ever. And in the Bible, it says, pray for these men. And the Bible says, as much as you can, obey these people. What Solomon is saying here in verse 2 is keep your oath. Keep your oath to God, and the way in which you do that is follow what the king says. So it's important to follow him and obey him. Now, it's true in principle, and we'll see also in prudence, 3 through 6. That's an old sermon that used to be taught many years ago. Obey the king in principle and prudence. And it came from this passage. Looking at verse 3, be careful of your reactions to those in power. You can completely walk away, but if you run away from those in power, don't listen to them, don't obey them, period, because you say they're evil, that's very, very dangerous. On the other aspect, if you follow them lock, stock, and barrel, that also can be dangerous. We're going to talk in Sunday morning sermon about the danger that comes from being around the wrong people. 1 Corinthians 15:33 tells us what? Evil companionship corrupts good morals. And so there's a danger which is there. Now, let's take a second and discuss this and work our way through this. I'm working through a book about Billy Graham. And so one of the joys of being married is I have found a lady who reads more than I do. So she is going through all my books and I'm going through all of her books. We're having a good time. Well, she had this book many years ago, and it's a biography of Billy Graham, but it's a biography of him working with the presidents. He started with Eisenhower, and he went all the way through to Barack Obama. He met with each one of them, prayed with each one of them, spent a lot of time with each one of them. The part of the biography I'm in right now is where he's with Nixon. And he has a lot of trouble with Nixon because he believes everything Nixon says. Nixon is his favorite president. He does not see anything Nixon ever did wrong until it's finally proven to him at the very end, and he realizes he's been supporting somebody who is wrong. Sometimes we can get in trouble because we are so close in a relationship to somebody in government or somebody in power that it turns out looking like we are supporting them or we're with them. And you got to be careful with that. Should Christians be active in government? Absolutely we should. And it's good for us to be Republicans. It's good for us to be Democrats. It's good for us to be the salt and the light on this earth. But be careful that you don't get so involved in partisanship that you lose your influence as a Christian. You got to be really careful about that. And that's something of what he's saying here. It's not valuable for the Christian to run so far away from politics that he doesn't vote, he's not active. That is not a positive thing. But it's also dangerous for a Christian to get so involved in politics that he loses his place. And he loses truly who he is. And so that's a little bit of what he's talking about there. All right. Verse 4, in the face of absolute power and possible circumstances, it's good to compromise. We compromise until what happens? Issues of morality, right? Until somebody forces us to start going away from what the Bible teaches. And at that point, you got to start teaching. At that point, you got to stand up. And so he says here in verse 4 and 6, you got to be careful. You got to be careful when you ask the king, what in the world are you doing? Right? You read Daniel. And Daniel, every chapter, the first 6 chapters, ends up having to chew out a king. What in the world are you doing? Now, of course, sometimes it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Sometimes it's something else. But notice every time he does it with great respect. Oh, king, I wish this dream you had applied to your enemies and not to you, right? Or, oh, king, I wish that this dream would not happen if you would repent. These sort of things won't happen to you. Be very careful when you correct someone in this state. Now, let's bring that to modern day application. We got to be careful in the way in which we approach people sometimes. Now, you've got the John the Baptizers who stood out there and called everybody a snake and told them they're going to hell, and they still came out and they still ate his grasshoppers and they still got baptized by him, right? That was his thing, and they really came out there. But sometimes I'm afraid we push people away from the Lord's church because the way in which we approach folks. Why is it important to approach people in a spirit of meekness and grace? Looking at 1 Peter 3:15. Why is that important? All right. You want to work with them, you've got to do it in that way. It's the way Jesus did. Look at him in, John 4, talking to the Samaritan woman. Okay. Do people in today's society enjoy being told that they're wrong? It's not even millennials, right? I mean, it's not just millennials. I know I don't like people telling me I'm wrong. The other day we were driving. Lonnie and I went to a preacher's retreat. We were driving back, and I was following my little map on my phone. It was telling me where to turn. And we turned off the road, and it was a gravel road. That's not a good thing because we're looking for the interstate. But I'm not going to admit I'm wrong. Right, Lonnie? After a little while, it turned into a dirt road. We still went, and it turned into grass. But finally, we made it back to the road. And, of course, I was right. But probably wasn't doing what I was supposed to do. But none of us like to be corrected. And so, knowing that knowledge, how is it that you do a Bible study with somebody? How is it that you bring them to Christ? If you know people don't like to be corrected. They've got to see the need. Yeah. And you've got to have a discussion with them where sometimes they're the ones who find the answer. Where they find that they're right. They're like, well, wait a second. This Bible says that in order to become a Christian, I need to be baptized. And you're like, well, you don't say, that sort of thing. But there's an art to relating to people in that way. And that's something important that the writer here, Solomon, is saying, be very careful when you approach a king to know when and where to say something. In the same way, you and I have got to be very careful in our approach. Whether it's with spouses, whether it's with children, whether it's at work, whether it's at church, whether it's evangelism. It's very important to measure your words, to know when to say and how to say certain things. That's just really important stuff for us to know. All right, verses 7 through 9, he talks about how even those people who are in power, no one has power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit. Other translations will talk about the wind here, okay? No one has power over the day of their death. No, there is no release from war. Wickedness does not deliver those who are given to it. What he's saying, if you want to put this in our language, okay, is there's no one who has power over circumstance. No one has power over the day of their death or mortality. Nobody has power over what other people are doing, war. No person has power over God's judgment. No matter how powerful somebody looks, and no matter how smart or how rich or how together somebody has it, they're facing those four things. They're dealing with other people. They're dealing with circumstances in life, maybe health problems, maybe financial problems. They're dealing with the day of death, realizing the end is going to come, and they've got to deal with God's judgment. Now, that should humble us, and it should humble everybody who's out there. And every single person one day will be facing these things. Verse 9, one rules to his own hurt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so watch where you are in life. Don't allow a fat bank account to change who you are. Don't allow a plum job to change who you are. Don't allow the place that you are in life to change who you are. Recognize you're still dealing with things in life. All right? How do people change when they face issues like that? Issues of health, issues of circumstances, issues of mortality. Not morality, mortality. What are some things that change in a person's life when he goes through something like that? Okay, what's really important? Your priorities change somewhat. A lot of times you realize how important family is. You wish you had more time with some people that maybe you lost. Okay, what else? Yes, sir, Dan? Sometimes people will get bitter from these things. Yeah, sometimes it doesn't turn out well for people because they get bitter. They're like, man, this happened to me and I didn't deserve this. And they end up sometimes even turning away from God. That's a great danger. Okay, sometimes there's depression to deal with. Everything is down and hurting, and it's hard to get to moving. Hard to be happy. Okay, say that again.
A lot of times it takes time to prepare to change, but change is immediate.
Sometimes we need time to change or time to get ready for change, but usually things don't wait for us. Change is immediate. Like that. Yeah. That's true. That's true. Okay. All right, let's read 10 through 13. Okay. Then I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of holiness. And they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This also is vanity, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. Therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set on them to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are but a shadow, because they do not fear God. All right, verse 10. Remember back in Old Testament days, not a lot of talk necessarily about heaven. The way in which they saw blessing from God was honor they received from other people, possessions, and lots of children, right? And so when God is blessing somebody, that's the way they're usually blessed. Verse 10, Solomon says, I look around and I see evil people and they say nice stuff at their funerals. You ever notice that? Just about every funeral you go to, no matter how much of a rascal that guy is, man, they preach him into heaven sometimes, right? That sometimes happens. You've heard that old joke about that preacher. This guy is a rascal in his church, and the guy comes and says, I need you to preach the funeral. It's his brother. And the preacher says, I can't do it. There's nothing good about this man at all. And he says, I will pay off the church building if you will come preach his funeral and say some positive things about him. And he's like, he needed that church building paid off. So he went and, he said, this man here is a horrible guy. He was a liar, an adulterer. And everybody was thinking, well, what in the world? He's supposed to say something nice. And he goes on and on. He says, but he is 10 times better than his brother. Right? Have you heard that joke? That's an old preacher's joke. Well, when people, they're on the table and they see the light and they die, they come back to life or whatever, however real that is, or if it's just synapses popping in their brain or whatever. Notice these people write these books, they never go to hell. What do they always see when they die? Bright light, beautiful angels, harp music, all these sort of things. Hardly anybody ever wakes up in torment. Well, a lot of times we're that way in our funerals. Somebody dies, and no matter how bad they are, we always praise them when they die. And that's something that happens. Now, maybe you've gone to a funeral where it wasn't that way, where they sat there in that funeral and said, man, this guy was a rascal. But usually we don't do that, especially in our culture and society. And Solomon says, we look around sometimes and we see that. And sometimes we look around and we see evil people being blessed, and we see good people going through persecution. Sometimes we see these evil people, and man, their children are doing great, and man, they kept that job at the plant, and man, they have, this beautiful lifestyle and all these wonderful things. And we think, here I am going to church, here I am working to be a Christian, and I've lost my job, and my children didn't turn out, and things didn't go the way they should. And we say, well, God, if you're up there and in charge, why do you do this way, but don't do that way? Why is this going on? Now, we're familiar with the Bible. We've read Habakkuk, right? Habakkuk argues with God. Funny prophet, because he never really prophesies until the end of the book. He spends his book arguing with God. He says, God, where are you? The rich are oppressing the poor. And God says, I've got this taken care of. I'm sending the Babylonians, and they'll kill everybody. And Habakkuk says, no, that's not the way it's supposed to happen. The Babylonians are worse than we are, so why would you allow them to conquer us? And God tells Habakkuk, write this on big letters, write this on a huge sign, so somebody even running by is going to be able to see it. The just shall live by faith. In other words, I'm going to take care of it. And that's why when you get to chapter 3, the end of it, Habakkuk says, this is how strong my faith is. Though the gardens and the fields be empty, though the stalls where I keep my cattle may be empty, I will still praise the Lord. The Lord has made my feet to be like a goat's feet, to where I can climb the steepest hill, because my faith is so strong. Well, that's the way it is for us. Sometimes we wonder. Now, what is God saying in response? God sees the full picture. See, I look at something from a very small, minute angle. I can't read your heart. You can't read my heart. We know each other and know a lot about each other, but you don't know everything going on in my life. And of course, I don't know everything going on in your life. But I know that God is in control. And I see some people who don't love the Lord, and it looks like God's blessing them, but he's doing it for a purpose. So fascinating to me to see when Jacob goes to Israel, or to Egypt. Remember, Joseph has that dream. The Egyptians who did not believe in God, the Egyptians who oppressed so many people, got filthy rich out of that deal by oppressing the Hebrews and everybody else in the world to buy grain from them. Egypt became the richest country in the world, to the point where they were able to enslave the Hebrews and build great cities. Now, we would look at that and say, well, God, you got this messed up. You've got bad people doing well and good people who are in slavery. But what's God doing? Now that we can look back, what was God doing? He was guiding. He was changing them into a nation, giving them a shared background, putting them in a place where they could reproduce like crazy to be a nation. And in all that money the Egyptians were gathering was nothing more than an investment plan to give money to get Israel through the wilderness. And so he is giving these evil people money in order to help God's people. Now, from our perspective, since we have read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua, from our perspective, that makes perfect sense. From a slave in Egypt, that didn't make sense at all, because he didn't see that perspective. It's the same thing with us today. We look at this and we say, God, you've messed that up. You allowed this good person to suffer and this evil person to prosper. But if we step back into God's shoes, remember at the beginning of class we talked about wisdom and stepping back, putting ourselves in God's place. God knows what he's doing. and he works life out the way it should work out. All right, verse 11, classic verse. The longer you wait for judgment, what happens? The more evil people become. What's cool in the Old Testament, there's no jails. You ever think about that? When you read through the book of Leviticus, when you read through the book of Exodus, no jails. If you stole something, you were punished then. If you killed somebody, you had to wait until the change of the priesthood, let people cool off. But it was never more than just a few years until judgment came. Why? The longer you wait, the harder judgment is to see, and more people are encouraged. Now, what's wrong with our culture? Someone will murder somebody when they're 18, be put on death row, and then you see pictures of them when they're 70 and they're old grandpa-looking guy, and everybody feels sorry for him, right? Because he doesn't look like he could hurt a fly, because we waited 60 years to met out judgment. And so our court's case makes it where it's not really, it doesn't scare people into doing right, and that's a problem we have sometimes. All right, so verse 11, 12, just because we don't see immediate judgment for God, don't suppose God doesn't care or that God is weak. God's going to bring judgment to all people. Now, 14 through 17, we're not always going to understand life. Why is it that when evil people seem blessed and righteous people are persecuted, why is it that those things happen? Solomon says, I want you to recognize you're not going to find every answer to life. Now, if you're like me, that bugs you. I like to completely solve a puzzle. I'm one of those guys where when I put together a puzzle, I can't put it halfway and then walk away and do something else, because there has to be resolution to everything. And Solomon says, you're not going to find resolution to everything. What he says in this passage is spend time eating, spend time drinking, spend time with your family, spend time enjoying life, spend time enjoying even though you don't understand why God has done everything. Because if you spend your whole life stressed out about what everybody else did, and if you spend your time stressed out about the way things are going, you're going to wake up one day and life will be done. And Solomon says, always spend time rejoicing. You'll never understand everything that's happening. Job, we see this 21, 24, but Job in his life, did he ever get to read chapter 1 and chapter 2 about God and Satan arguing? He was never told that, was he? He was just told at the end, you be faithful, I'm in charge. Well, that's pretty unsatisfying, isn't it? Same with that we read here in Psalms, same with what we read of in John. Enjoy life and have faith in him because he will take care of you. All right, thank you for being here. Thanks for this time we had together. There it is.